Welcome everyone to this new lesson on Womp3D. Today we will look at the curves, other fundamental elements for creation beside the primitives, and you can find them in the objects menu on the top bar as well as the primitives. In addition to the basic curve, there is a selection of other preset curves that you can use in your project, but we will see them in a moment. So let's start by removing the initial scene objects by selecting them from here and then add the basic curve consisting simply of 2 points. This appears here on the left in the list in a few union, and we see that it has an additional sub-collection of the points of which it is made up. So if I want to select the entire curve and move it, for example, I will take it from here, while if I want to select a single point, I can select it from the list or take it within the work area. It is then possible to move each point individually in all directions, scale it, and we can make the curve bigger or smaller at one end, and then rotate a point to have a screwy effect. Now you can see anything because our shape is created from a sphere, which of course rotated in any direction is always the same, but another very useful function is to swap the basic primitive that generates the curve. So we can change between sphere, cylinder, or cube from here in the top right, or also, as we have already seen, from here to the left then, and rotate a point that is at the end, we can have this curving effect as it becomes more pronounced. With just 2 points, then we can also create a cone very easily if we know how to do it. Let's add a new curve and place 2 points one on top of the other, then move it up a little bit, and then see the x and z coordinates of the other one to place it right on top of it. At this point, if we want a cone, we'll have to choose the cylinder as the generating shape by clicking here on the entire curve, and then we can adjust the topmost point by actually making it the tip, so the radius equals 1, while we adjust the second half to make it flat, so we just adjust the height to 1. Here's our cone, which we can also easily stretch or flatten this way. So let's try now creating a new curve. This time let's add more points. You simply click on the plus icon and then you can move it or scale it as you wish. However, be careful because when we add a new point, it overlaps the one below it. So we have to pay attention to where it will also be placed in the list once is it created. Because if it will be in the middle, it will also be in the space in the middle, and therefore we're going to create a new point from the middle of our body, while if it will be at the top of the list, it will be the new end that we can edit, while everything that was already there will remain unchanged. To delete a point, we must instead click on it and press the backspace or delete key on the keyboard, or even delete in the menu that pops up in the list. Let's increase our point a little bit now, which will always be edible anyway, and then assign them different materials just to see the situation a little more colorful. We see that, as it was for the group feature, again the materials are going to blend with each other in transitions of colors, materiality, and all their characteristics, so we can have a more pronounced effect. The roundness function here of each individual point of the curve, as with any body, allows you to round the cube, for example, until it becomes a sphere. But roundness here, by clicking on the curve in the list, so the general roundness, allows you to change the sharpness of the transitions between points. The density option allows you to create a spacing between the shapes that give the curve. I will show you this option by creating a linear trajectory, again with a new curve, so it is easier to visualize. Let's assign 2 random materials and see now the density of the curve from here, and by reducing it to 1, we see how only 1 point remains. By entering 2 instead, our shape is divided in the middle by another sphere, creating 2 gaps. With 3 instead, the 2 spaces created go further subdividing and so on until the space is completely filled, and this can be a very useful feature, especially if the intent is to arrange shapes at a certain distance from each other in a straight line or along any trajectory, as here, also with a variation even in shaded colors, as in this case, or even create a staircase. So let's take this more complex curve here, and then we decrease the density of the curve to have it fractioned into the number of steps we want, And finally, we click on each point on the list to reduce the height of these cubes and make them thinner and more workable one by one. So if we change the roundness of the curve, we also have rumps that are not completely straight. If we rotate a point, we will have like folding steps maybe. In short, you can play and experiment a lot on these aspects, as you have seen. The group between points on the same curve, on the other hand, works in the same way as we have already seen. So it simply goes to increase the mass of the matter on the curve as to inflate it, and if the density is low, we can create a special joining effect on the various fragments. So for the group or subtraction of negative forms, and thus the interaction between a curve and an external object, all forms must be part of a union to affect or be affected by other primitives or curves. So if we click here, add an object, and add, for example, a cube, and we want it to be negative, and dig it our curve, we have to insert it into its own union. Beware, though, that if we try here, it will give us a red line, because our perceived intent is that we want to add it as an additional point of the curve, and we will be told that we cannot naturally insert a primitive or another curve or another union as children, that is, in short, components of this curve. So we have to be careful to put it slightly lower, and at this point we can proceed to make it negative and subtract material. Another very important option to consider is the use of fixed point, which allows us to lock one or more points of the curve so that by moving only one point consecutive to it, we will have the construction of a broken line and no longer a smooth curve. And if we deselect the option, it will return a curve naturally. In modeling jargon, you can say that you have the option to enable a management of the calculation that determine the values of the point of the curve, which is a linear management. And so we talk about linear interpolation between only 2 points, as opposed to the interpolation of what are called Bezier curves that there is between all the other points instead. Let's talk briefly about Bezier curves, because it is a very recurring topic in computational graphics, whether it is 3-dimensional but also 2-dimensional, and the most striking example is vector graphics such as that of Illustrator to understand. But a great many other programs even paint as them, so it can certainly come in handy in the future as well. Bezier is the surname of the French engineer to whom we owe the application in the field of industrial design, in this case automobiles, of these curves that are nothing more than the result of algorithms for solving parametric functions, because we are talking, of course, at the end of the day, always about mathematics and geometry. But don't worry, we are not going into those aspects. What we do care to know instead, although then having an incentive to go deeper is always a good thing, and in my opinion this is a fascinating subject, is that these curves are created precisely because of the very point that make them up. Womp uses B-splines or Bezier splines, curves that connect multiple Bezier curves together by changing the parameters whenever a new point is added. But let's analyze the basic theory. The simplest Bezier curve is the quadratic curve, which means it has only one control point. Let's try to create a new curve now. At the beginning, we have only 2 points, and then a segment. Now let's stretch it quickly and then add the third point. In the middle, between the two, it becomes the control point, which will decide the point where the curvature will be, and then the point where the ideal tangent will pass, which then corresponds to the line of the handles in Illustrator if we want to make a comparison. At this point, we see that the other 2 points at the extremes remain stationary, and if we continue to bring the control point up further, it will become detached from the path of the curve. But that is more than normal, because the curve must be contained completely in the convex set of its control points, in simple terms, in this triangle that has been formed. We see now that if we click on the curve in the list and decrease the smoothness with roundness, it goes back to a broken line, as we saw before. So, especially when we go to add more points, it is an important parameter, because in this case the interpolation between points implemented to maintain the continuity between the various curves, and therefore the continuity of tangency will be more evident to make sure, pass me ways, that there is not a jumble of curves that have not really managed to be connected together. A most tangible, beautiful example of this case is given to us by one of the default curves that we are now going to look at. We start right from the last helix that represent just the W of the Womp logo. If we take a look at the points, we see that they are very far from the true path and that they form a rhomb arranged in a helix horizontally, and that only the starting point and the ending point lie on the trajectory that is returned to our view. How is this possible? Well, the secret really lies in the wise use of the control points that define the curve and in the intensity of the curvature. In fact, if we go to see the overall roundness, we find that it is pushed to the maximum value, while if we go to reduce it to 1, here the magic disappears. Because we are back to a linear interpolation, and also with a continuity of tangency that is not perfect, so with low values, we see that it is not an acceptable result. Let's see now the S shape, which instead has all the points all very close together, and this is because it is actually a more complex shape than it may seem. And if we see the roundness value, we can guess that in this case, if we increase to the maximum, we will have another style of the letter, more minimal, casual, and less structured, we could say. The same goes for the shape of the donut. If we observe it, it is composed of numerous points, and then here also comes into play the preset goop that gives the right texture to our donut. Whereas, for what concerns the square shape, you might think that it is a closed shape, but indeed it is an open curve, and if we see, we take the 5th point, and this moves and reveals an opening. Here we have a value of 1 of roundness, and if we try to increase it, it will show us a very curved shape. Finally, the teardrop shape, or blob, as it is called here, is simply given by 4 points. Put one on top of the other of decreasing size, so that the last one at the top is almost unnoticeable because it has a radius of 0.01 and all are tied together by high density and a bit of goop. I hope you can now be more conscious in creating scenes and can create some very original and well-designed curves as well. Thank you for watching so far. If you found the video interesting, please leave a like and a comment for any doubt or suggestion. Subscribe to the channel, and if you feel like supporting us, you can also subscribe as a supporter to always create new content, and we will see you in the next video.